Okay, thanks a lot for the lecture. Now we have time for questions and answers, and we have quite a lot of time. So please. Samo dignite ruku i mikrofon će doći do vas. Evo ga.
Thank you for the lecture. I was just wondering, since I did not read the book, and I'm very sorry for that, how do you think that we should use Zizek's dialectics repeat Marx? Because he obviously was not right. Things that he predicted, and saying this in Zagreb, in the capital city of...
Sorry, I can't hear you very well. Can you just hold the microphone a little closer? Further, yeah, okay. That's
saying this in Zagreb, in the city, which is the capital city of the nation that Marx noted as anti-revolutionist because being opposed against the Hungarian Revolution in 1848. The history has obviously shown, despite all the elaborations, that Marx wasn't right. His predictions did not come to life. So your position, as I understood it, and Zizek's and I like your lecture, I like the way of thinking, but it's the simple reality, it did not come true.
Which predictions are you thinking of?
The Marx predictions of a very close system, abolishment of capitalism and coming of socialism that will produce the commons eventually. It did not realize.
After 1848, Marx was actually fairly pessimistic about the possibility of revolution in Europe. Yes? He thought it had receded considerably, for the most part. Yeah? So I don't think it's true to say that Marx himself was full of revolutionary optimism and then something didn't happen. Marx himself varies very much in his political hopes or fears. Yeah? And after 1848 in particular, Marx thought that there was quite a long haul, in the approach to socialism. He engaged himself, of course, very much with social reform. Marx was never an opponent of social reform. So I don't think the idea that Marx imminently expected some socialist revolution and was then proved wrong is actually correct. He might have done so in the 1840s, certainly not by the time he was writing Capital, I don't think. And of course, many socialists who came after Marx themselves didn't imagine that there was going to be an imminent revolution, hence the development, for example, of evolutionary socialism or reformist socialism and so on. So I think the question is a little more complicated, perhaps, than you might suggest.
Mikrofon čeka još uvijek, samo trebamo ruku.
Samo prekidač prema gore, ništa drugo. Idite drugo, može doći dobro. I'm just trying to fill in the time while other people think about the questions. So I told myself that I had to come up with something to make things go. Yeah, but you can hear me?
Oh.
So I was going to ask you something, and this is, it would seem to me that you actually don't think that, as Marx would say, that the capitalist system ends up in bringing the contradictions that have to be resolved finally in a violent manner for the society to evolve in a sense of more justice or more freedom. So what do you do with this, with the Marxist idea that the contradictions will You seem to eliminate the Marxist idea that the contradictions, that the capitalist society will end with the contradictions that have to be resolved in a violent manner. What do you do with this Marxist idea? How do you comment on that?
Actually, I thought at first you were speaking Croatian. Just because he was too close to the mic. The way you resolve, where are you? Sorry, where have you gone? Here. The way you resolve that is you read my chapter on revolution. Brilliant book. And there you will find that once again, there is a caricature of Marx's own thinking, and Engels' is thinking. Marx thought that some revolutions could be peacefully accomplished. Yeah? In certain places in Europe, he even thought that about Britain at one time. Also, he was aware, of course, that processes of social reform can be extremely violent. Many processes of social reform have been more violent than certain revolutions. For example, compare the Bolshevik Revolution, which was astonishingly unviolent on the whole, with, say, civil rights in the United States. It's quite a mistake, and it's again part of the caricature of Marx that there's peaceful reform on the one hand and violent revolution on the other. Marx, of course, was a great believer in social reform. Marx concerned himself with the Factory Acts in Britain, many other aspects of industrial society in Britain. He made no simplistic contrast between reform and revolution, or indeed between violence and non-violence. And he did think that a revolution that was truly democratic, and of course for Marx, a revolution has to be democratic. Marx is not talking about a coup d'etat, he's talking about the great mass of people, as is happening now, as we speak in other countries, that he thought, and I think rightly, that it was the democratic nature of revolutions that was the greatest safeguard against excessive violence. Because, even a state, when it sees, as in Egypt or Tunisia, that it can't carry on, without at least the passive support of many of its people, might concede defeat. Yeah? So I think the democratic nature of revolutions for Marx and the hope that violence will be limited as much as possible are related. Let me just say finally, of course, that the reluctance of the socialist and working class movements over history to shed blood has been in marked contrast with the readiness of ruling classes to do so.
Isprika za probleme sa mikrofonom, ali eto sad imamo bežični koji radi, pa molim vas za još pitanje. Evo ovdje jedno.
If you say that Marx believed that some of the revolutions would be able to come about in a peaceful manner, this, I would say, directly implies that he also saw or believed that other revolutions will come about in a violent manner. Yet he, to my knowledge, did not object to that. If this is so, then we can at the same time say that he thought that revolutions were democratic, because democratic revolutions and violent democratic revolutions, I'd say, constitute a contradiction. And related to that is the sort of optimism that you talked about, Marx, at the beginning of your speech, when you said he had faith in revolutions that can come about in a peaceful manner. History has shown that they didn't come about in a peaceful manner, but not only that, it is the fact that he didn't object even if they come about in a violent manner. So how can we accept that and still say that he was a peacemaker?
Well, I didn't say he was a peacemaker. I said that he believed that some revolutions could come about peacefully, and Engels certainly claims that one must strive for peaceful change as far as possible. Yeah? Now that's not the normal image of Marx, I think you must face that. And the reason why, of course, some revolutions are violent is because of the resistance to them of the ruling class. You know, the ruling class has far more instruments of violence at its disposal than does any opposition to it. Look at what is happening in the Zagreb today. Yeah? Far more instruments of it. And if revolutions become bloody, it is very frequently because peaceful means are met with violent opposition by ruling classes. That's very much the story of the British working class movement, where I come from. That essentially peaceful attempts at reform or change were met with the bullet and with the bayonet. Nobody I know doesn't believe in violence. Nobody I know doesn't believe in violence. Okay? There is a tiny and very brave minority of people called pacifists. Pacifists are not people who don't like violence. Hardly anybody likes violence, apart from, the odd sadist or psychopath. You know. The difference between pacifists and other people is not that pacifists are against violence and other people are for violence. If pacifism is to have any interesting content, it must mean there is no situation whatsoever in which violence is legitimate. I think that's not only wrong, but actually quite immoral. I can think of all kinds of situations where if you didn't use a controlled amount of violence, you would have a lot of explaining to do. Yeah? Just think about it. So let's not have this illusion that socialists believe in violence and other people don't. The ruling class throughout history has been unutterably more bloody, more ready to commit genocide and so on than any oppositional movement ever has been. Yeah? The point I was making is that Marx, contrary to the popular image, thinks that the more violence can be limited, the better. But he thinks the problem with that is that ruling classes are too ready to resort to arms against peaceful protest, and if we want examples of that, we just have to look around the world today.
Osoba sa mikrofonom, tamo je osoba koja želi mikrofon. Radu. Probajte.
Hello, can you hear me? Yeah. Thanks very much for this wonderful lecture. Very humorous too. A simple question. I was always interested in the concept of dealing with theory on one hand and power on the other hand. Because if we can, many of the intellectuals today see Vladimir Lenin as a man who deviated theory. You know, in the October Revolution and all those wonderful books that he wrote. So I would like to ask for your opinion today. What do you think about the meaning of the authoritarian character of Marxist theory? Because some theoreticians today likely point out that Marx too, in the First International, expelled and had a hegemonic relationship with theory. And what about Bakunin on one hand? And today we have the same example with Slavoj Žižek, because he accused Simon Critchley of a highest form of corruption. I would like you to comment on that, if you can.
I'm afraid I couldn't understand all of that. Combination of technology and the accent. I mean, I read from the end of my book at the beginning, I actually remember I said that Marx was very hostile to abstract dogma. Marx is peculiar in the sense that he was part of that long line of philosophers or theoreticians who are quite hostile to philosophy and theory. You know, I mean, there is a line, of course, of so-called anti-philosophers, Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, all the way to Adorno, Derrida, Wittgenstein, Freud, perhaps. I mean by anti-philosopher, not just somebody who doesn't like philosophy, because that would probably include Brad Pitt. You know. I mean somebody who is opposed to philosophy for philosophically interesting reasons. Somebody who wants to take apart the current, the conventional definitions of philosophy, yes, and do philosophy in a different way. And all of those anti-philosophers, in whom I would include Marx, are scrupulously concerned with literary style, because part of their attempt to dismantle the philosophy they encounter is to find a different way of writing, as one sees in Wittgenstein, Derrida, Adorno, and so on. So philosophy and literature begin to make strange alliances. So Marx is a theoretician who doesn't think that theory is for its own sake, yes? On the other hand, a lot of Marxists, I mean, he would have agreed with Lenin's famous quotation from Goethe's Faust, grey is theory, my friends, but green is the tree of life. Marx would thoroughly agree. But he didn't think much of theory. It's a pity that he knew it was a pity he had to spend so much time analysing theoretically. That was not his choice. That was necessary if people were to live differently. At the same time, Bertolt Brecht once remarked that he wanted a society or a situation in which, he said, thinking could become a real sensuous pleasure. You know, a bit like eating, you know, or sleeping. What he meant, what Brecht, I think, meant, among other things, was there's a kind of rather crude or vulgar Marxist idea that thinking isn't really permissible unless you can instantly cash it in terms of practice. Ironically, that's a very bourgeois utilitarian idea of the relation between thought and practice. Yeah. Thought and practice don't always form some miraculous unity, as some Marxists like to think. The relations between them, the unevennesses, the asymmetries, are historically conditioned. Sometimes thought, theory, overshoots practice by a long way, and sometimes, as for example in the early years of the Russian revolutions, practice theory has to move very quickly to catch up with practice. So the relation's very different. I'm saying all this because I didn't really hear what you said. Apart from the words theory, Zizek. Who is this Zizek? and Simon Critchley. But anyway, I hope you might make some sense of this.
Thanks for your answers. I think we can give the floor for some new questions. We have some time. So, okay. Here and then a question behind.
I would also like to thank for the lecture filled with esprit.
Can you please stand up?
Yes.
Not all people see you, so. Thanks.
I found especially interesting this little thread that you mentioned just briefly about radical thought and synchronicity. This thing, synchronicity and radical thought. I found that especially interesting because the prejudice that I have with Marxism, or Marx's legacy to say, so to speak, is a sense of linearity and not really synchronicity. And I think I recall I've read something about some so-called heterodox Marxists who actually debunked the inevitability of capitalism, that that capitalism as read through orthodox Marxism is inevitable, but according to this heterodox sort of thinking about it, there could have been a situation where a different kind of mercantilism, a different kind of development went through. And I think it's specifically pinpointed at the conditions of England with the sort of proto-proletarian bosses and all of that, and also combined with Calvinist theology. So, no, in general, I would like to hear a little bit more about these temporal modal aspects, like synchronicity, linearity, inevitability.
Yeah, that's a huge issue, of course. I can only skim the surface of it. I don't think it's heterodox to say that capitalism isn't inevitable. I don't know of any point where Marx says it is. Yeah? As though it grows organically out of feudalism. And certainly we know that socialism doesn't follow inevitably from capitalism. That's a matter of politics, whatever Marx may have thought. There's a much firmer case that Marx thought socialism was inevitable, actually, than that capitalism was, although he's ambiguous about that. Yes, of course, I don't think very many interesting Marxists have ever believed in some strict linearity of modes of production, I think. For one reason, as Althusser usefully points out, most societies are a combination of different modes of production, some older, some later, some prefigurative of the future, and so on. For another thing, as Marx himself said, societies move at different rhythms, different tempos. He actually denied that he was projecting a certain European model upon the whole of global history. So I think there are all sorts of ways in which, it's not a simple evolution of modes of production in that sense. There's a lot of looping back. That happens materially as it happens with Benjamin culturally. Yeah? Benjamin is a kind of cultural version of that.
So we had a question there, and then here a new question. Горе треба те само повчало.
Okay, I have just a short question. Can you draw a line or differentiate the Marx understanding of power and the productive power, the ethics and strategies that concern the concept of affirmative power that you mentioned before? Thank you.
Again, I only just heard that. Can one draw a line between affirmative power,
affirmative, productive power,
yep,
and Marx understanding of power, like Foucault and Marx?
Oh yes. Well, I don't think that Marx's understanding of power is negative, simply, in the way that so much postmodernist understanding is. I think Marx had a very strong sense of power. Well, it's part of his radical romantic heritage, that he sees the idea of power as something positive and creative. However, I think one can draw a line here between Marx and Foucault. Yes. When Foucault says that power is productive, he doesn't mean that, I think, in a moral sense. Foucault is scrupulously amoral. Because if he were not, he would have to address the question of whence he derives his moral values. And he's very afraid of any kind of transcendental answer to that. When Foucault says that power is positive, is enabling, allows you to do things, that applies just as much to ruling powers as it does to subordinate ones. Marx believes that, but he also wants to make a moral and political distinction between them, as I think Foucault wrongly fails to do. When Marx says that power is productive, that is in the deeper sense, in the most classical sense, an ethical as well as a descriptive statement. It's a normative statement as well as a descriptive one. Whereas Foucault maintains a scrupulous neutrality as far as his evaluations of different kinds of power go. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you. So here we have another question.
Thank you for the brilliant and marvelous book, and even more brilliant lecture, and for the British accent as well. I was just wondering, actually, wouldn't you find it quite paradoxically that Marx wasn't thinking of American society when thinking of socialistic revolutions? If we take into account that prerequisites for the socialistic revolutions were the bourgeois societies and capitalism, consumeration. So, isn't that, what's your opinion on that kind of thing? Of course, I know that we have to observe things from historical perspective, but then again, isn't it a bit weird that he wasn't thinking of American society? Thank you.
I'm not quite sure why you think that's weird. Could you just say a bit more about the weirdness? What do you think is weird about that?
Можете му вратити микрофон, pa da...
You've gone.
It's a bit weird because American society is at a certain point is highly organized bourgeois society and capitalistic society, and when he talks about this kind of, when he thinks clearly of socialistic revolution, he thinks of British society, German and Western European society that had, of course, proletariat class, of course. And I was wondering, isn't that a bit weird that the American society that appeared to be the most powerful one in our history wasn't actually included in his thoughts?
Well, I'm no expert on American society.
You're a Marx.
I mean, some of my best friends are Americans. My wife, for example. And I think 3 of my 5 children are Americans. Haven't asked them recently, but I think they are. Marx, of course, had a lot to say about America. I mean, he was a journalist. He wrote journalism for America, and made many perceptive comments about the contemporary social and political scene in the States. But of course, the hegemony, I may be wrong about this, but I think the hegemony of the United States are seeing the United States as the prototype of advanced capitalism, actually only begins to happen, doesn't it, towards the end of the 19th century, as, for example, British capitalism becomes increasingly overtaken both by American and German capital, I think, as part of the build-up to the First Imperial World War. So I'm not surprised about that so much, although, of course, Marx was interested in societies that had revolutions, if not quite within living memory, then fairly recently, France being the obvious example. Yeah. What is the difference between a society which has a memory of revolution, as France famously does, and a society like Marx's own adopted society of Britain, of England, where the revolution happened in such a sort of staggered and complex way that it was as though it never really happened. And of course, all the most successful revolutions are those that we have completely forgotten about. You know, those that we thrust into the political unconscious. Edmund Burke, the greatest Irish political thinker of all, thought that the way ruling powers survived was simply by surviving long enough for people to forget about their exploitative origins, about the fact that almost every state on earth was founded by occupation, revolution, invasion, extermination, and so on. The longer the state survives, the more that is mercifully thrust into the political unconscious, and a kind of saving oblivion takes over. This is why states like, say, Israel or Northern Ireland are in such trouble, because they haven't had time to legitimate their rule. In this way, for Burke, the sheer passage of time is a far more forceful argument for hegemony than any complex hegemonic mechanism. So Marx was interested in the United States in that sense. It makes a difference to have a bourgeois revolution almost within living memory. Whereas, of course, we British have inherited a tradition of gradualism, middle-of-the-roadism, because of the peculiar way in which our history has been transformed. For example, if we ever decide to drive on the right side of the road, we shall do so gradually. Not all in a rush. That's the way the French do things. Piecemeal.
So, okay, maybe a chance or the last round of questions. If there are any questions at the upper floor of the cinema, because okay, there is. So we'll wait a second till the mic comes up.
Good evening. In your lecture, you spoke about the revolutionary...
Can you speak a bit?
Yeah, I'm trying to.
Where are you?
There.
You spoke about the revolutionary potential of the tragedy, and you also said that the capitalist system is a prerequisite for socialism. So do you think that the global economic crisis that's happening right now, with Greece and a lot of people losing their jobs, is this the tragedy of socialism, of capitalism? Is this the tragedy of capitalism that will make us embrace socialism? At least, I mean, for Croatia the second time, and for you the first time.
I mean, the first thing to say, I think, is that, of course, as I suggested, what Marx thought was really revolutionary was capitalism. Yeah? It was capitalism he thought was really revolutionary, because he thought it was just by the nature of the beast, something which was endlessly, restlessly transformative, couldn't stand still for a moment, agitating, transmuting one thing into another. I mean, a good reason for being a socialist is just to get some rest. In the middle of this utter maelstrom of constant restless change, as it were, for its own sake, or accumulation for its own sake. Walter Benjamin again to quote him, said, revolution is not a runaway train, it's the application of the emergency brake. Yeah? It's capitalism that's out of control. It's the inherently anarchic force that not even its rulers can control. Yeah? And it's socialism which attempts to apply some human control and rationality to this beast which, you know, is, as it were, rampaging wildly. Just to touch on your actual question, I don't think that, I mean, no socialist I know thought that the crisis of capitalism, you know, that we've been living through was going to lead to socialism. I mean, for that, you need much more than a crisis of the economic system. Yeah? You need a lot of patient, organized, political, cultural, other kinds of work. It would be a crude kind of economic determinism, wouldn't it? Of the kind that I don't think Marx believed in, that somehow a crisis of capitalism would automatically lead to socialism. On the contrary, I mean, a crisis of capitalism means that a lot of people will get hurt, a lot of people will be damaged, yeah? And a lot of confidence will be dented, and a lot of political forces and energies will be rolled back and locked in on themselves. The problem for socialism is this: yes, a demoralized people is not the most likely agent of political change, not at all. You know? On the other hand, a people that is feeling utterly confident and assured doesn't see the need for transformative political change. People who have too little identity are going to have problems of having the courage and confidence of political agency. People who have too much identity won't see the need for it. Yeah? The world, if you like, divides down the middle, roughly, between people who have too much identity and people who have too little. And moreover, each camp helps to reinforce the other. Just as at the moment, the world divides down the middle between people who believe too much, fundamentalists, whether, you know, Texan or Taliban, and people who believe far too little, you know, jet-setting, postmodern executives of various kinds. Moreover, each camp helps to reinforce the other. Each camp pushes the other into a more extreme kind of position, and then there are decent, rational people like myself, standing in the middle, who believe just about enough, right? Neither too much, nor too little. One of the most disastrous aspects of postmodern culture is that belief itself, conviction, has come to many people to mean dogmatic certainty. Yes? So that for a certain kind of postmodern skeptic, you can't have passionate conviction without being at least incipiently an authoritarian dogmatist. Yeah? That's profoundly mistaken. This, of course, is the main reason why the youth of today, particularly in America, say "like" every 3 seconds. I mean, to say, you know, it's 9 o'clock is objectionably authoritarian, you know, it's certain, you know, or say it's like 9 o'clock. It's kind of skeptical.
Maybe it's because of Facebook. I think this is it. Thanks to all of you who are coming to the conference, and thanks for everything.